My daughter-in-law handed me coffee with a smile. Seconds later, my housekeeper knocked it from my hand and whispered, "Don't drink it." 5 minutes later, someone collapsed, and I realized the person trying to kill me might be sitting at my own table. I was about to hand more control of my $12 million company to my only son when my daughter-in-law placed a cup of coffee in front of me and smiled like nothing could possibly be wrong. 5 minutes later, the woman who had worked in my home for 20 years deliberately knocked that cup out of my hand. As she dropped to her knees and pretended to clean the spill, Rosa leaned close. "Don't drink it. Just trust me." I stared at her, confused. Rosa Martinez was the least dramatic person I knew. She had stood beside me through my husband's funeral. Rosa did not panic, so when I looked into her eyes and saw real fear, something inside me changed. Minutes later, someone else in that room began to collapse. That was when this stopped being a family meeting and became something much darker. Before I tell you what happened next, welcome to it When Family Breaks One. If stories about trust, betrayal, family, and the choices people make when love is tested mean something to you, please subscribe to the channel. My name is Evelyn Whitmore. I was 64 that morning, and until then, I believed I understood betrayal. I had been a widow for 15 years. My husband, Charles, died from a heart attack, leaving behind a manufacturing company, a house full of memories, and a wife many people assumed would step aside. Before Charles died, I organized charity dinners. I did not know how to read a balance sheet, then grief forced me to learn. I studied contracts at night. I asked uncomfortable questions. I walked factory floors and listened to employees who understood the business better than many executives. Slowly, the company stopped feeling like something Charles had left me and became something I was capable of protecting. By 64, Whitmore Industries was worth roughly $12 million. People saw the number. I saw Charles. I saw employees. I saw a legacy I believed would one day pass to our only son, Carlton. Carlton was 39 and had worked at the company for 5 years. I loved him in the complicated way parents sometimes love adult children, with pride, worry, memory, and more excuses than we realize we are making. He was smart, but impatient. He liked expensive suits, fast decisions, and the appearance of being important. Charles believed leadership meant responsibility. Carlton sometimes seemed to believe leadership meant being the person everyone else had to listen to. Still, I told myself he would mature. He was my son. That sentence explained more of my blindness than I understood at the time. His wife, Ever, had joined the company 2 years earlier as marketing director. She was polished, charming, and unusually attentive. She remembered my favorite restaurants, my medical appointments, and when important meetings were coming up. At the time, I called it thoughtfulness. Later, I would call it something else. Rosa had been with our family for 20 years. She knew my routines better than anyone. Every morning, she prepared my coffee the same way, in a blue porcelain cup that had belonged to my mother. 3 months before that meeting, Ever began arriving early on certain mornings, mostly when I had important business to discuss. Around the same time, I started feeling unwell, dizzy, weak, nauseated, sometimes strangely confused. Once, during a board meeting, I lost my train of thought halfway through a sentence. I laughed it off, but privately it terrified me. Carlton said I was overworked. Ever suggested retirement. My doctor said stress could explain a lot. All of those explanations sounded reasonable, and that is what unsettles me most. When people we trust give us an explanation we want to believe, we often stop asking whether another explanation fits the facts better. The morning of the meeting, Carlton arrived carrying a leather briefcase. Ever came later with pastries and coffee. "I thought you might like something different," she said. Rosa had already made my usual pot. Ever knew that. I noticed it, but I did not question it. She poured the coffee into my blue cup and handed it to me herself. The first sip tasted unusually bitter. "New roast," Ever said. Then Carlton opened his briefcase. He said he wanted to discuss succession planning, but the conversation quickly became something else. He wanted me to begin stepping away from day-to-day control immediately. He had paperwork prepared, authorization forms, transfer documents, agreements he described as routine. I asked which lawyers had reviewed them. He avoided the question. That should have been enough to stop me. Instead, I took another sip. Within minutes, warmth spread through my chest. My head felt light. The words on the papers became harder to focus on. Ever watched me. "You look pale." "I'm fine. Finish your coffee. You'll feel better." I still remember that sentence. "Finish your coffee." Carlton pushed the documents closer. "It's mostly a formality, Mom." I reached toward them, but my hand felt heavier than it should have. That was when Rosa entered carrying a tray she had no reason to be carrying. She moved beside my chair. She stumbled. Coffee spilled across my lap. Ever snapped at her instantly. Rosa ignored her, bent down, and whispered, "Don't drink it. Just trust me. I did." And for the first time that morning, I stopped behaving like a mother trying to keep peace and started thinking like the businesswoman Charles's death had forced me to become. I watched Ever. I watched Carlton. Both were far more upset about a spilled cup of coffee than either should have been. Ever tried to replace my drink. Rosa interfered again. The documents were soaked. Carlton became furious. Ever went quiet. Then Ever pressed a hand to her forehead. She tried to stand. Her knees gave way. Within moments, Carlton was shouting her name while I called for an ambulance. I looked at Rosa. She was frightened, but she was not surprised. And then the thought came to me, so terrible I wanted to reject it immediately. What if whatever was happening to Ever had been meant for me? At the hospital, doctors told us they suspected toxic ingestion. Carlton immediately suggested calling Rosa and having her clean the living room before police arrived. I told him no. Everything would stay exactly where it was. For 1 second, my son's expression changed. What I saw was not confusion. It was calculation. And in that moment, I understood Rosa's warning had not ended the danger. It had only exposed the first crack in a family secret I was nowhere near prepared to uncover. What happened in that hospital waiting room forced me to accept that Rosa's warning was not an isolated act of fear, but the first clue in something she had been silently trying to understand for months. I waited until Carlton stepped away to take another call before I walked outside and phoned Rosa. She answered immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore." Her voice was quiet, but tense. "Rosa, I need you to tell me the truth." There was a long silence. Then she said something that made the noise of Boston traffic disappear around me. "I've been watching Mrs. Ever for almost 3 months." I closed my eyes. Watching her do what? Things I didn't understand at first. Rosa asked if we could meet somewhere away from the house. She did not want Carlton or Ever knowing we had spoken. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in the back corner of a small cafe several blocks from the hospital. Rosa looked exhausted, not physically tired, burdened. There is a difference. She placed a small notebook on the table between us. The cover was worn from being opened too many times. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "Then tell me now." She opened the notebook. Every page was filled with dates, meetings, times, short observations, my symptoms, Ever's arrival times. I stared at the pages and felt a strange sensation I can only describe as embarrassment mixed with fear. Someone else had been documenting my life more carefully than I had. Rosa pointed to one entry. February 12th, Mrs. Ever came at 8:30. She said she wanted to help set up for your meeting. She handled your coffee. By 11, you said you felt sick. She turned the page. February 21st, same thing, another page. March 4th, she came early. You felt dizzy during lunch. The pattern continued. Then Rosa showed me the days when Ever had not come early. No symptoms, she said. I wanted to argue, not because the evidence was weak, because the conclusion was unbearable. Maybe it was coincidence. I thought that too. Her answer was immediate. That's why I didn't tell you. That sentence mattered to me. Rosa had not jumped to an accusation. She had doubted herself first. She had looked for patterns. And I think that is one of the most important things about what she did. When something feels wrong inside a family, emotion can pull us in two dangerous directions. We either accuse too quickly, or we explain everything away because we are afraid of what the truth might cost us. Rosa did neither. She watched. She wrote things down. She waited until the pattern became harder to dismiss. About 6 weeks earlier, she told me, She had seen Ever standing over my coffee in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Rosa would not describe what she saw in technical detail. What mattered was that Ever was doing something secretive to a drink intended specifically for me. After that, Rosa began taking photographs when she could. She slid her phone across the table. The images were ordinary enough that anyone seeing them without context might have ignored them. Ever near the coffee, Ever reaching into her purse, Ever glancing toward the doorway. But once you knew the pattern, the pictures felt different. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. Rosa looked down. Because Mr. Carlton had already warned me twice to stop asking questions. My stomach tightened. What questions? About the business. About why, Mrs. Ever was always coming early. About papers he left in your study. She swallowed. He told me I was getting too involved in things that weren't my concern. So you were afraid he would fire you? Yes. Then she looked directly at me. But this morning I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed quiet. That was the moment I stopped seeing Rosa as someone who had merely protected me. She had risked the stability of her own life to do it. People like to imagine courage as something dramatic. Most of the time, it is not. Sometimes courage is a woman with bills to pay deciding that losing her job is still better than ignoring what she believes could destroy another human being. Why? I asked. Why take that risk for me? Her eyes filled with tears. Because you took risks for my family. Years earlier, Rosa's daughter had needed surgery that Rosa could not afford. I had helped. To me, it had been something I was fortunate enough to do. To Rosa, it had never been forgotten. You never treated us like we were beneath you, she said. I couldn't watch someone hurt you and pretend I didn't see it. I reached across the table and took her hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "There's more." Of course there was. By then, I was learning that every answer in this nightmare opened the door to something worse. Rosa turned to another section of the notebook. "Master, Carlton has been moving money. What do you mean?" I saw documents in the study. Transfers from company accounts. How much? I couldn't see everything, but enough that I started writing down the numbers. The amount she had documented was already in the hundreds of thousands. Then came the insurance policies. Several of them. Policies connected to my life with benefits large enough to make my death financially valuable in ways I had never authorized emotionally, even if paperwork somewhere had been made to look proper. Rosa had also overheard conversations about my will and about how soon Carlton might gain control of Whitmore Industries. I felt cold. This was no longer only about a cup of coffee. It was about money, ownership, inheritance, control, and perhaps most painfully, timing. My son had not simply been waiting for me to retire. He might have been arranging his future around the assumption that I would not be there to question him. I told Rosa to take everything she had collected to the police. "Do not go back to the house first," she nodded. "And don't stay alone tonight." "What about you?" "I'm going back to the hospital." "Mrs. Whitmore, if Mr. Carlton knows you suspect him." "I'll be in a public place." I tried to sound stronger than I felt. But before I left the cafe, I looked at Rosa's notebook one more time. Those pages disturbed me almost as much as anything Ever might have done, because they showed how much can happen in plain sight when every individual incident seems too small to confront. A strange visit, a missing document, an unexplained illness, a relative suddenly interested in finances. One by one, they are easy to rationalize. Together, they can tell a very different story. When I returned to the hospital, Carlton was sitting beside a man in an expensive suit. He introduced him as an attorney. That did not prove guilt. People have every right to seek legal representation, especially when police are becoming involved. But what disturbed me was not the presence of a lawyer. It was Carlton's urgency to construct a story before anyone had even accused him. He spoke about misunderstandings, about how investigators might unfairly focus on family members, about how Rosa had been acting strangely. Then the doctor returned. The tests confirmed that Ever had been poisoned. The police were notified. Carlton went pale. I watched him carefully. Again, I saw fear. But I no longer knew whether he was afraid for his wife or afraid of what investigators might find. Within hours, the case widened. Rosa was questioned. For a short time, suspicion fell on her because she had been present, handled household items, and had deliberately interfered with the coffee. Carlton seemed almost eager to point investigators in her direction. I was not. I told Detective Sarah Chen everything. Rosa's warning, my symptoms, Carlton wanting the room cleaned, the financial concerns, the notebook. Detective Chen listened without interrupting. Then she told me Rosa's account matched mine. More importantly, Rosa had brought evidence. Investigators began examining financial records and other material connected to Carlton and Ever. What emerged was worse than I had prepared myself for. There were life insurance policies on me totaling roughly $5 million. There were transfers from Whitmore Industries into accounts Carlton controlled. There was evidence connecting Ever to what had happened to me over the previous months. The details blurred after that. $5 million, hundreds of thousands missing. My company, my health, my son. I sat across from Detective Chen and suddenly remembered Carlton at 7 years old, running through our garden with a handful of crushed flowers because he wanted to bring his mother something beautiful. After Charles died, that same boy, older then, but still my boy, held my hand at the funeral and promised he would always take care of me. I looked at Detective Chen and asked the question I had been avoiding. When did I stop being his mother? She did not answer. There was no answer she could give. When did I become something he could profit from? That was when grief finally arrived. Not loud, not theatrical. Just a terrible understanding that money can reveal something about a person you may spend years refusing to see. The next morning, Carlton was arrested. I thought that would be the worst moment. I was wrong. Detective Chen told me Rosa had provided recordings of conversations between Carlton and Ever. Conversations about me. And according to her, what they said when they thought I could not hear them was far more painful than anything investigators had found in a bank account. The recordings did not simply tell me what Carlton and Ever had done. They forced me to hear, in their own voices, what I had meant to them when they thought I was too trusting to ever find out. 3 weeks after Carlton's arrest, I sat across from District Attorney Margaret Sullivan in an office that felt too ordinary for the conversation we were about to have. There was a legal pad on her desk, a glass of water beside my chair, and a small speaker placed between us. She warned me before she pressed play. "Mrs. Whitmore, some of this may be difficult to hear." I almost laughed. Difficult had become such an inadequate word. My daughter-in-law had been poisoning me. My son had been moving money from my company. Investigators had uncovered insurance policies worth millions. I had already watched the life. I thought I understood collapse piece by piece. What more could a recording possibly take from me? Then Carlton's voice filled the room. He was talking about me, not angrily, not emotionally, casually. That was the part that hurt. He sounded like a man discussing a delayed shipment or an inconvenient client. He complained that I was becoming suspicious. He talked about how weak I had seemed during meetings. Ever laughed and reassured him that everything was still moving according to plan. I sat perfectly still. There are moments when your body protects you by becoming quiet because feeling everything at once would be too much. Sullivan did not interrupt. Neither did I. The recordings moved from one conversation to another, each one stripping away another excuse I had unconsciously kept alive. I had wondered whether Ever had manipulated Carlton. I had wondered whether he had simply been weak. I had wondered whether he was terrified of losing his marriage and had followed her into something he never truly wanted. His own voice answered those questions. And somehow, hearing it aloud made the betrayal feel more permanent than before. He was not reluctant. He was not horrified. He participated. Worse, there were moments when he sounded pleased that I was becoming less able to challenge him. That realization broke something in me that the financial evidence had not. Money could explain greed. Fear could explain desperation. But enjoying another person's decline required something colder. And when that person was your mother, there was no business language strong enough to make it understandable. The conversations also revealed what Carlton and Ever planned to do with Whitmore Industries after I was gone. They spoke about cutting staff, selling assets, moving portions of the operation elsewhere, breaking apart parts of the company because they believed the pieces might be worth more than the whole. I thought about employees who had stayed with us through recessions, equipment failures, and the years after Charles died. To Carlton and Ever, those people were numbers. To me, they had names, families, mortgages, children in college. That difference suddenly seemed to explain more about my son than any psychological theory could. The financial investigation had also deepened. The amount missing was not merely what Rosa had first suspected. Investigators believed more than $300,000 had been improperly diverted. Carlton had not been waiting for an inheritance. He had already begun taking pieces of it. Sullivan paused the recording. "There's something else." By then, I had learned to fear those words. She explained that my home security system had captured audio in several main rooms. I had barely thought about that feature when the system was installed years earlier. Now those recordings independently supported parts of what Rosa had documented. That mattered because Carlton's defense could no longer dismiss Rosa as a resentful employee inventing accusations. The house itself had heard them. I remember staring at the speaker and thinking how strange that was. For months, I had walked through those rooms believing they held the ordinary sounds of family life. Coffee cups, footsteps, Carlton calling me mom, ever asking whether I was tired. Behind some of those moments were conversations I was never meant to hear. Investigators had also recovered handwritten material from Ever that tracked changes in my health over time. Sullivan showed me copies. I will not repeat technical details, because they are not what matters. What matters is the intention behind the pages. Ever had documented my decline with the detached concentration of someone monitoring a project. Fatigue, confusion, weakness, dates, progress. I stared at her handwriting and felt less like a mother-in-law than an object that had been observed. That was when Sullivan told me Ever had a professional background that gave investigators reason to believe she understood the risks of what she was doing. Even more disturbing, authorities had found research concerning other older or financially vulnerable people connected to their social circle. No one could say with certainty what would have happened next, but the possibility alone changed the scale of what I was hearing. This might not have ended with me. And that is something I keep returning to when I think about abuse inside families. We often search for a single dramatic moment because it is easier to understand. But harmful behavior can become a pattern precisely because the person doing it learns that trust creates access and silence creates opportunity. Rosa had interrupted that pattern. Not because she had more power than Carlton or Ever, because she had been willing to believe what the evidence was showing her. Sullivan then told me Ever's attorney had approached prosecutors. She wanted a deal. Her version was simple. Carlton had created the entire plan, frightened her, pressured her, and convinced her that I was preparing to cut him out of my will. For a few seconds, I was too stunned to respond. Then I asked, "She said I was disinheriting Carlton?" "Yes. That is completely false. My will had remained essentially unchanged since Charles died. Carlton was my sole heir. He knew it. More than that, before everything happened, I had been actively considering giving him greater responsibility at Whitmore Industries. He was not fighting to save an inheritance. There was nothing to save. The future he claimed to fear losing had already been waiting for him. That truth made the entire crime feel even more senseless. Greed had convinced them to destroy what patience would eventually have given them. But Ever was not the only one trying to rewrite the story. Carlton's attorney, Jonathan Blackwood, was preparing to argue that Ever had manipulated him. So there we were. Ever claimed Carlton controlled her. Carlton claimed Ever controlled him. When they believed I would disappear quietly, they had been partners. Now that consequences had arrived, each wanted to become the victim of the other. I found something almost revealing in that. Their loyalty lasted exactly as long as their shared interests. When the money disappeared from reach, so did their devotion to one another. Sullivan asked how I felt about Ever receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against Carlton. I thought about the woman who had smiled at me across breakfast tables. The woman who had asked about my health. The woman who had stood beside my son and talked about family. Then I thought about the recordings. "No," I said. I did not say it out of revenge. I said it because I no longer believed either of them should be allowed to hide behind the other. Whatever the court ultimately decided, I wanted the truth stated plainly. 2 adults had made choices. 2 adults had participated. Neither became innocent simply because consequences frightened them. That evening, Rosa came to see me. We sat near the hotel window while the city moved below us. She seemed hesitant. "I heard other things on those recordings," she said. I already knew from her face that I was not going to like what came next. "They made fun of you," I looked at her. Rosa explained that Carlton sometimes mocked the way I spoke during meetings, the way I worried about employees, the way I still referred to the company as something Charles and I had built together. Ever laughed about how easy I was to reassure. They joked that I was desperate to believe they loved me. I thought I had reached the deepest point of betrayal already. I had not. There is something almost easier about hatred when it is honest. An enemy who dislikes you gives you a boundary. You know where you stand. But contempt hidden behind affection attacks your memory. Suddenly, every birthday dinner becomes questionable. Every hug. Every phone call asking whether you got home safely. Every, "We're worried about you?" Were any of those moments real? That was the poison I could not measure. The physical harm had frightened me. The emotional poisoning changed the way I looked backward at my own life. And this is where I believe an important distinction begins. Forgiveness is not the same thing as trust. Trust is not the same thing as reconciliation. People sometimes pressure victims to collapse those three ideas into one because family is family. But letting go of hatred does not require pretending harm never happened. Peace does not require reopening the door to someone who has shown what they are willing to do once they are inside. 6 months later, I walked into a crowded courtroom and saw Carlton sitting beside Jonathan Blackwood. Ever sat at a separate table. Reporters filled the benches. The story had become public now, but to me, it was still painfully private. Blackwood stood and began describing my son as a vulnerable man who had fallen under the influence of a manipulative wife. I listened to him carefully. For the first time, I understood what the trial would really ask me to endure. It was not only going to examine what Carlton and Ever had done, it was going to ask a jury to decide which version of my family was true. By the time the trial began, I understood that the courtroom was not going to decide whether my family had betrayed me. I already knew that. But whether the truth could survive every attempt to rename betrayal as weakness, confusion, or someone else's fault. The courtroom was crowded every morning. Reporters filled the back rows. A few employees from Whitmore Industries sat quietly behind the prosecution. People I did not know had come simply because the case had become the kind of story strangers found impossible to ignore. A son accused of plotting against his own mother. A daughter-in-law accused of helping him. Money. Inheritance. A family business. To everyone outside that room, those were the headlines. To me, Carlton was still the child whose fever I had sat beside all night when he was 8 years old. That was the part no headline could explain. When he entered the courtroom, I barely recognized him. The expensive suits were gone. So was the confidence that had once made him seem larger than every room he entered. He looked thinner, older, diminished. Ever entered separately. She did not look at me. I remember wondering whether that was shame or strategy. I stopped trying to guess. Jonathan Blackwood began Carlton's defense exactly as I had been warned he would. He described my son as a man who had become emotionally dependent on a sophisticated, controlling wife. He spoke about Ever's intelligence, her professional background, her ability to influence people. He suggested Carlton had been pulled gradually into decisions he never would have made on his own. For a moment, I almost wanted to believe him. That is difficult for me to admit. There was still a small part of me searching for a version of events in which Carlton had somehow remained the boy I remembered. But wanting an explanation and having evidence for one are very different things. District Attorney Margaret Sullivan did not answer Blackwood with outrage. She answered him with facts. Detective Sarah Chen testified about the investigation. She described the financial records, the insurance documents, the material recovered during lawful searches, and the evidence that connected both Carlton and Ever to what had happened. There was nothing dramatic about the way she spoke. That made it stronger. She did not need to exaggerate. The evidence already carried enough weight. Then Rosa took the stand. That was one of the hardest moments for me. For 20 years, Rosa had moved through my home quietly enough that most people barely noticed her. Now an entire courtroom was listening. She explained how she had first noticed patterns in my health, how certain visits seemed connected to those changes, how she began documenting what she saw because she was afraid that speaking too soon without evidence would only cause her to be dismissed. She did not make herself into a hero. She simply told the truth. And I think that was why the jury watched her so closely. Courage often becomes more convincing when the person describing it does not seem interested in being praised for it. Then the recordings were played. The room changed. I had already heard many of them, but hearing those voices in public was different. Carlton's words no longer belonged only to my private grief. Now strangers heard what he sounded like when he believed no one would hold him accountable. They heard resentment. They heard greed. They heard a man who was not merely being dragged behind someone stronger. Blackwood had spent days building the image of a passive son. Carlton's own voice kept tearing that image apart. Ever's records created the same problem for her defense. Her attorneys tried to separate intention from action, to suggest she had been pressured and emotionally trapped. But the documentation showed persistence, planning, and independent participation. The prosecution's argument was simple in principle. Whatever influence existed inside their marriage, both adults repeatedly made choices that mattered to me. Not because I wanted either of them punished more harshly, because accountability becomes meaningless when every harmful decision is explained entirely through someone else. Blackwood called people who had known Carlton before his marriage, a college friend, a former business associate, someone from our church. They spoke about the Carlton they remembered: funny, generous, ambitious, a good friend, a loving son. I believed some of them. That may surprise people. But human beings are not simple enough to fit comfortably into one description. Carlton may once have been many of those things. What he once was did not erase what he later chose. That distinction became important to me. Sometimes families remain trapped because they keep defending the person someone used to be against the evidence of who that person has become. Memory deserves tenderness. It should not be allowed to overrule reality. The defense also introduced psychological testimony, suggesting Carlton could have been manipulated by Ever over time. I listened respectfully. Manipulation is real. Coercive relationships are real. People can absolutely be influenced into behavior that contradicts their former values. But Sullivan asked a question that stayed with me. If Carlton had no meaningful agency, how did that explain the money he moved on his own? How did it explain conversations where he expressed resentment toward me without ever prompting him? How did it explain decisions that benefited him directly? The answers became less convincing as the questions continued. This was not a courtroom declaring that manipulation never exists. It was a jury being asked to decide whether that explanation fit the evidence in this particular case. That difference matters. Then came my victim impact statement. I had rewritten it several times. At first, I filled the pages with anger, then grief. Eventually, I threw almost all of it away. When I stood before the court, I decided to say the one thing I had finally understood. The worst poisoning was not physical. The courtroom was completely still. The worst poisoning was emotional. I explained that physical recovery had been possible. Doctors could monitor my health. Time could restore some strength. But emotional poisoning behaved differently. It moved backward through memory. It made me question birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, phone calls. Every moment when Carlton had asked whether I was feeling all right. Every time Ever had told me to rest. Every expression of concern became something I had to examine again. That was what they had taken from me. Not only security, trust in my own memories. I looked at Carlton. I loved you before I understood what you had done. That love was real, even if your choices were not worthy of it. His face changed, but I could not tell what he felt. I am not going to spend the rest of my life hating you. Those words surprised some people. They did not mean I was excusing him. They meant I was refusing to let his choices continue governing my emotions. I can forgive you and still never trust you again. I can release hatred without reopening my life to someone who tried to destroy it. That was the moment I finally understood the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness was mine. Reconciliation would have required something from Carlton too. Truth, remorse, change. I had not seen those things. The jury deliberated for several days. When they returned, I held Rosa's hand. Carlton was found guilty on the major charges. Ever was also found guilty. Under the outcome described in this story, both ultimately received life sentences. People later asked whether I felt victorious. I did not. Justice is not the same thing as victory, and accountability is not revenge. I had not defeated my son. His own choices had led him there. That distinction protected me from becoming consumed by the idea that I had somehow destroyed my family by telling the truth. The family had been destroyed when deception became more important than love. Afterward, I returned to my old house one final time. In Carlton's childhood bedroom, I found a photo of him holding a handful of dandelions toward the camera. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. For months, I had been asking myself when that little boy disappeared. That day, I finally asked a different question. What was I going to do with the life he had failed to take from me? The question I carried out of Carlton's childhood bedroom was no longer why he had become the man who betrayed me, but what I was going to do with the life that betrayal had left behind. I sold the house within months. Maybe part of me was running from the memories, but I had learned this during the trial. Survival is not always about staying where you are to prove no one can drive you away. Sometimes survival means refusing to keep living inside a place that has become emotionally unsafe. Every room had been altered by knowledge. The kitchen was no longer simply where Rosa had made my coffee for 20 years. The living room was no longer just where Charles used to read beside the fireplace. Carlton's bedroom had become a reminder of the distance between who I thought we had been and what I now knew. So I left. Not because Carlton had won, because I finally understood I was allowed to choose peace. Rosa helped me pack. While sorting boxes, I looked at her and realized how strange the word housekeeper had become. It no longer described what she was to me. She had noticed my decline. She had trusted her instincts when everyone else had explanations. She had risked her job and her own security to protect me. My son had shared my blood. Rosa had shared my burden. That difference changed the way I understood family. I called my attorney and asked him to help establish a foundation focused on protecting older adults from financial and physical abuse. Then I called Rosa. "I have a proposition for you," I said. She laughed nervously. "That sounds serious." "It is. I don't want you to work for me anymore." There was silence. Then I added, "I want you to work with me." The Whitmore Foundation began modestly. I provided funding, business experience, and connections. Rosa brought something I could not buy, the ability to notice what other people overlooked. She became executive director. She resisted the title. "I'm not an executive," she told me. "You saw what people with titles failed to see," I said. "You'll learn the rest," and she did. We began working with social workers, medical professionals, victim advocates, and law enforcement. Certain patterns repeated. An older parent whose adult child suddenly controlled every bank statement. A widow who stopped seeing friends because a relative insisted she was becoming confused. A man who discovered that someone he trusted had been taking money from him for years. What connected them was the same terrible question. How do you protect yourself when the person causing harm is someone you have spent your life loving? That became the real work of the foundation, not revenge. We wanted people to understand that trust and awareness can exist together. You can love your family and still ask questions. You can accept help and still understand your own finances. You can listen when a caregiver, friend, doctor, neighbor, or bank employee notices something concerning without assuming loyalty requires silence. I stopped punishing myself for not seeing sooner. Carlton and Ever had depended on familiarity. They knew I would search for innocent explanations because they were family. That is what manipulation often exploits. Not stupidity, trust. Years passed. Carlton sent letters from prison. I returned them unopened. Some people struggled to understand. "He's still your son," I heard more than once. Yes, biologically, he was. But biology did not obligate me to continue exposing myself to someone who had never shown the kind of remorse reconciliation would require. I had forgiven him in the way that mattered for my own healing. I no longer woke up angry. I did not wish suffering on him. But forgiveness did not mean pretending the door between us was safe to reopen. Forgiveness is something you may choose for your own peace. Reconciliation requires two people. It requires accountability, changed behavior, and evidence that the relationship will no longer operate by the same destructive rules. I never received that from Carlton, so I let the relationship end. Ever died in prison several years later after a conflict with another inmate. When I heard, I felt no satisfaction. Justice had already occurred in court. Her death was simply another ending. I had become more interested in beginnings. The foundation grew beyond anything Rosa or I expected. Eventually, we opened the Rosa Martinez Crisis Center, a safe residential program for older victims who needed somewhere to stay while their cases were investigated. Rosa cried when she saw her name on the building. She said she did not deserve it. I disagreed. For years, she had been introduced in my home as the help. Now her name stood above a doorway where frightened people walked in and found help of their own. Detective Sarah Chen eventually retired and joined our work, helping professionals recognize patterns they might otherwise miss. I also reconnected with Margaret, Charles's sister, after years of distance. Through her, I recovered pieces of family that had nothing to do with Carlton. We talked about Charles. We laughed about old stories. We built something new from a relationship that had been neglected rather than poisoned. Slowly, my definition of family expanded. Rosa, Margaret, Sarah, the people at the foundation, survivors who became volunteers who became friends. I had spent most of my life assuming family was something you inherited. I learned very late that some of the strongest families are built by choice. 10 years after the morning that changed everything, I was 74. Rosa lived nearby, and we still shared coffee most mornings. That detail may sound small. To me, it was not. For a long time, coffee had represented deception. Now, sitting across from Rosa in the morning light, it meant conversation without performance and trust that had been tested rather than assumed. By then, the Whitmore Foundation had expanded into multiple states. We had supported hundreds of elder abuse cases and helped recover millions of dollars in stolen assets. But the numbers were never what mattered most. What mattered was the moment an older woman realized she was not imagining what was happening. The moment a frightened man discovered that asking for help did not make him weak. The moment someone understood that protecting yourself from a family member does not make you disloyal. It means you are protecting the life you still have. Carlton wanted my legacy to become something he could inherit. Instead, he forced me to discover that legacy is not what you leave to one person. It is what your life makes possible for others. That is why this story stays with me. What matters is that cruelty did not get the final word. Rosa's courage did. My boundaries did. The work we built afterward did. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to remember, it is this. Pay attention when something feels wrong, especially when you are being pressured to ignore your own judgment. Take sudden changes involving money, control, isolation, or access seriously. Do not confuse forgiveness with permission. And never assume blood alone tells you who your real family is. Family reveals itself in behavior, in who protects your dignity when doing so costs them something, in who respects your independence when controlling you would be easier, in who tells you the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. The coffee that was meant to become the symbol of my ending became, strangely enough, the beginning of the most meaningful years of my life. And if you were in my place, I wonder what you would have done. Could you forgive your only child and still decide never to see him again? And have you ever had someone outside your family show you more loyalty than someone connected to you by blood? Tell me what you think in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest family stories are not really about how relationships break. They are about what we finally learn to build after they do. Kate. What stays with me most about Evelyn's story is not the money, the courtroom, or even the terrifying realization that the people closest to her were willing to harm her for what she owned. It is the way her understanding of family changed after everything she trusted was stripped away. For years, Evelyn believed love meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. She believed being a good mother meant remaining patient, forgiving mistakes, and protecting family relationships even when something felt wrong. But what she eventually learned was much harder. Love without boundaries can become an opening for manipulation, and trust without awareness can sometimes place us in danger. Rosa changed that lesson forever. She did not share Evelyn's last name. She was not included in the inheritance. She had no financial reason to protect her. In fact, speaking up could have cost Rosa her job and security. Yet when she saw something wrong, she chose courage over convenience. Carlton, on the other hand, had everything Evelyn intended to leave him and still wanted more, faster. That contrast is why I believe this story is ultimately less about betrayal and more about how we define loyalty. Real loyalty does not demand that you surrender your judgment. Real love does not require you to ignore warning signs. And forgiveness does not mean giving someone unlimited access to hurt you again. Evelyn eventually forgave her son because she did not want anger controlling the rest of her life. But she also understood that reconciliation requires more than history or biology. It requires responsibility, remorse, change, and rebuilt trust. She never received those things from Carlton, so she chose peace without reopening the relationship. And perhaps the most powerful part of her journey is what she did afterward. Instead of allowing betrayal to become the defining event of her remaining years, Evelyn transformed what happened into something useful. She helped create resources for older people facing financial exploitation, manipulation, isolation, and abuse. The experience that almost destroyed her became the reason other people found protection. That is a kind of victory no courtroom can provide. The deepest lesson I take from Evelyn's experience is simple. Protecting yourself does not make you cold, selfish, or disloyal. Sometimes it is the healthiest form of self-respect. In everyday life, that means paying attention when someone suddenly becomes unusually interested in your money, property, documents, health decisions, or personal independence. It means keeping important financial information organized, staying connected with people outside a single relationship, and listening when someone you trust notices a pattern you may have missed. It also means learning to separate three things we often confuse: forgiveness, trust, and reconciliation. You may forgive for your own peace. Trust must be earned. Reconciliation should only happen when genuine change makes the relationship safe and healthy enough to rebuild. And above all, remember this: family should never be measured only by blood. Sometimes the person who respects your dignity, protects your independence, and tells you an uncomfortable truth is showing you more love than someone who has called you family for decades. Now I'd like to hear your opinion. Do you think Evelyn was right to forgive Carlton but never allow him back into her life? Please share your answer in the comments so everyone can read and learn from different perspectives. And if this story gave you something meaningful to think about, please subscribe to it When Family Breaks One. Your support helps motivate us to continue creating more thoughtful stories about family, betrayal, boundaries, healing, and the difficult choices people sometimes have to make.